Okay, so the evolutionary psychology model then is, again, very intriguing. It has a lot of support. There are different people that feel that it has much to add to the field. And again, just because some pieces may be less substantiated than others doesn't mean we're looking at this as throw one field out in favor of another. But those people that take more of a human behavioral ecology approach look at things a little bit differently, okay? One of the big differences that they use is that instead of there being these domain-specific mechanisms in the brain, they believe that there are more domain-general mechanisms in the brain, and that these general mechanisms act more flexibly so that individuals can maximize their fitness in current environments, that we're not sort of stuck as completely acting like our ancestors, but that we've been able to maximize fitness even in today's kinds of environments. All right, so what they'll do is look at how contemporary environments can give rise to different fitness and maximization strategies, meaning let's look at who's having the most offspring in today's kind of current environments, okay? And that we don't need to invoke or study ancient mental mechanisms, right? To try to find ancient mental mechanisms, but to look at current behavior in relation to local environmental conditions. And this is, in fact, how animal behaviorists or behavioral ecologists, including myself, when I study spiders, right? Other people study other kinds of non-human animals. This is how animal behaviorists study the evolution of behavior in different kinds of organisms. And so the argument goes, since humans are also animals, you know, why should we be having a different field for studying humans versus all the other animals? And so human behavioral ecology takes this approach. So just to summarize what people that are human behavioral ecologists may have as problems with the evolutionary psychology approach, I have a little bit of a list here. So one is taking up the idea of the nature of the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. Was there really just a single environment that shaped the human brain? And if there was, what were the features of that environment? How would we even know what the particular features were of that single environment? How do we know when the EEA was exactly too? So people feel like that's a really big criticism of the evolutionary psychology approach. Many people do. The idea of domain specificity, as I was just talking about in that last slide. Do problem-solving modules have to be domain-specific? Okay? Couldn't there be cognitive processes? Okay, and that sentence might sound a little confusing, but can't there be a set of cognitive processes that deal with a range of adaptive problems? Okay, so maybe you have certain kinds of cognitive processes that could both address cooperation with relatives or altruistic behavior, as well as mate sensibilities or mating preferences. Does there have to be a separate cognitive area in the brain to solve all of these different problems? And wouldn't these domain general processes with their flexibility actually have some evolutionary advantages? Okay. As we go on here, the other problem with looking at domain-specific modules is that what's the relationship between these modules and brain structure? There is no real simple way to map them out. Although some evolutionary psychologists claim that it's just a matter of time until you open up a book, like you can open up an anatomy book right now and look up the heart or the lungs or the stomach and read all about how those organ systems function and how things are put together. And so evolutionary psychologists say that in the future you'll be able to open up a book and inside will be a list of these areas of the brain that relate specifically to all of those kinds of specialized modules that I just told you about on those other slides. And other people feel like they'll never be able to just do that simple mapping because the brain doesn't work that way, because the brain is more complex than that, because different areas of the brain can overlap with each other and can be used to do more than one thing. Okay, and the idea also that behavior and cognition are not the same thing. Okay, behavior and cognition are not the same thing. Not all behavior has to be driven by a mental cognitive process. Okay, so you could have a simple physiological system to accomplish behavior. So, for example, an organ like the heart solves a lot of pretty complex problems. It has to figure out how fast to pump your heartbeat rate. It has to figure out how to control blood pressure. It has to figure out level of oxygen. In fact, the heart, quote unquote, knows or takes into account a multitude of various kinds of information in order to function the way that it does. Okay, and so by analogy, humans and other animals, in fact, may be able to behave by taking into a lot of account of information without necessarily having to use cognition, without having to use thoughts that take into account a calculation of these different kinds of things. Okay, and then finally, what is going on here? The idea that genetic variation is something that is very small, that's not significant. The idea that humans have this true universal nature is definitely a big area of controversy. Human behavioral ecologists would say that the genetic differences amongst individuals can make a difference in how people behave. And evolutionary psychologists just assume everybody basically has essentially the same kind of genetic makeup, and that whatever little differences that there are not really significant as part of the adaptationist paradigm. And the idea is that, of course, if we all evolved in the EEAA back then we all have the same genes for the same kinds of modules now, and it doesn't really matter. And so they dismiss any importance of genetic differences among individuals today. And that idea is definitely criticized and taken up by other people who feel like there are definitely ways in which genes can influence people's behavior in today's environments. Okay, I know that both of these approaches are pretty complex, and I know that I'm not taking a lot of time to go over them, considering all that they involve. But this chart here at least summarizes some of the highlights here in this particular source that I've used. They're calling Darwinian anthropology all of these different fields where I've emphasized the human behavioral ecology as a term more. And then we got evolutionary psychology on the right. And one of the things that you can see right here is that these human behavioral ecology approaches are more like these behaviorist approaches as opposed to cognitivist approaches. Okay, and so I don't want to take the time to just read all this to you now. You can pause this and read them on your own, and I think it would be useful to try to take a little bit of a time to do that. But let me just highlight the idea that culture, for human behavioral ecologists or Darwinian anthropologists, culture should be viewed as part of a fitness maximization program, meaning that humans are flexible opportunists, okay, and that foraging, birth intervals, all this information can be used to sort of investigate how humans are behaving. And they concentrate on behavioral outcomes as opposed to looking at belief systems or values or emotions. Evolutionary psychologists, on the other hand, will interview people and ask them about what they believe or what they like or what their emotions are. And we're going to actually be looking at a study where we kind of do that ourselves and see how valuable that seems to be. Okay. Here we have the EEAA aspect of evolutionary psychology that's not in the other approach. Counting current babies as opposed to looking at ancestral selective pressures. You see these differences here. The idea of domain general mechanisms as opposed to domain specific modules. Here's the Swiss Army knife, right? Here would be just a regular knife. And finally, we talked about the importance of genetic variability, which still exists and it can still be influential, and particularly in mate choice. We'll talk about that later. And evolutionary psychologists saying that the little genetic variability and the idea of this universal human nature. So this summarizes some of the things that I've talked about before. And again, I don't expect you to have a really complex ability to compare, contrast, and critique these different approaches, but to at least get those main ideas down and understand that when we read some of the literature and some of the articles that you're going to start to look at, like cooperation among humans, gossiping behavior, sexual mate preferences, that different people have used these different approaches, and so they have some different assumptions underlying what they make as their conclusions from those studies. Let me just make sure that I'm clarifying the idea of behavioral adaptation versus cognitive adaptation. And that's not to say that evolutionary psychologists are saying that everything is cognitive, that we're always aware, because in fact, they also believe that you don't necessarily have to be conscious, even though you may have some cognitive functions that are involved there. But for example, behavior can definitely be adaptive without you being aware of it. And this example in an animal, the gray-lag goose, is a very classic example of if an egg rolls out of the goose nest, they will take it under the beak and roll it back into the nest. That makes sense, right? The egg got rolled out, they'll roll it back in. You can experimentally take the egg out of the nest, move it over here, and the poor goose goes and gets it and rolls it back. Well, what's interesting is that even if you take the egg out of the mix, if the egg's over here, the goose goes to roll it, and while she's in the middle of rolling the egg, if you come in here and take this egg away, the goose will continue to move back and slide its beak along the grass until it comes all the way back to the nest and keeps rolling an egg that isn't even there, okay? And so these are kinds of behaviors that are referred to as these fixed action patterns, these kinds of automatic innate response kinds of behaviors that solve adaptive problems without an animal being cognitively aware. And again, because the fact that this goose will do this even without the egg there shows that the behavior is eliciting certain mechanisms in the brain that causes it to do this. And there are probably examples of how humans also behave even in the absence of having this obvious conscious awareness of what's going on. This cartoon is just to further emphasize that a little bit, that humans were not designed to understand the causal processes that created their own psychology. And it's kind of funny here because here you have this guy talking to his son or whoever and saying that the male sparrow will stake out his territory, an instinct common in the lower animals, okay, without necessarily being cognitively aware of the fact that every person in this neighborhood has put up a big fencing system, and so humans are staking out their own territories as well, and that maybe not even thinking about our behavior as territorial behavior, and that thinking that maybe only so-called lower animals do that. And I've avoided using higher versus lower because those terms in evolution actually just aren't even accurate to begin with, and they do kind of connote a bias that humans have against other animals in the world. But anyway, the idea that we don't have to be consciously aware of processes in order to elicit that behavior. We don't have to be consciously aware of who's a relative to maybe exhibit altruistic behavior. We don't have to be consciously aware of the fact that when we find someone attractive, that we're making some sort of laundry list in our brain about why. Okay, so that our minds may be saying, hey, that person's attractive, and that there may be underlying processes for that we could uncover. And in fact, we could perhaps bring some of those to cognition when we think about that. I mentioned that in class as well, when we talked about men having lower thresholds for inferring sexual interests than females do. But because we're not always cognitively aware, it doesn't mean that the causal processes don't exist. And that will kind of wrap it up for this, and we will see you in class.